We're going to be talking about a human rights-based approach to shared prosperity. And there are two of us speaking here today. I'm Dunstan Allison-Hope, based in San Francisco. I lead technology and human rights work at BSR. BSR is a nonprofit organization that works with companies across a range of different corporate responsibility issues. I think everything from human rights to climate change to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or sustainability management and governance. So I spend a lot of my time working with the likes of Facebook and Google and Microsoft and others on how they approach human rights. And I'm joined by Paloma. Paloma, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Paloma Muñoz and I am based in New York. I right now work for the United Nations, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where I do a series of things, but one of which is to focus on developing guidance, standards, etc., to help advance responsible rights-based technology. And in that context, I focus on the role of institutional investors and their ability to ensure that companies in their portfolios respect human rights. And prior to this, I worked in many different capacities, but really focusing on the role of business in ensuring that people's rights in the workplace, in the community, online are respected. So good to be with everyone.
Great. So the presentation today really does two things. So one is to give a background to human rights and business in human rights. And then second is to share some thoughts and questions for this group for discussion. So starting at a very basic level, what are human rights? We tend to think of human rights as a basic code of conduct for all human beings. They are the basic rights that are inherent to all of us as human beings, regardless of nationality, residence, sex, national ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any number of other statuses. They are codified in a variety of different places. The key documents that we spend most of our time referring to are the International Bill of Human Rights, which consists of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was published in 1948, and the two accompanying covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But there are all sorts of other documents that are extremely relevant as well. The International Labour Organization has a number of core labor conventions that are extremely significant for human rights. And then there are a range of other international human rights instruments covering particular topics. Conventions on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, for example, the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the rights of the child. There are lots of other international human rights instruments that will inform our work. And there are also regional human rights instruments that are particular to different regions. Human rights cover, as you might imagine, quite a wide range of different topics. And I find this slide is quite useful because it gives a sense of the breadth of human rights. This slide summarizes the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as you'll see, there are a range of civil and political rights in here, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. And we always find it quite interesting, different preconceived ideas people have as to what human rights actually are. And we tend to find that sharing this list gives a good sense of the long list, the breadth of topics that are human rights. Human rights are indivisible, interdependent, interrelated. It's very important that we don't consider each right in isolation, but actually consider how it interacts with lots of other rights. And that said, it's quite helpful, excuse me, to think of human rights in a range of different categories. There are rights that relate to bodily integrity, the right to life, liberty, security, movement, freedom from slavery, freedom from torture. There are rights that relate to civil liberties, things like the right to a fair trial, freedom of opinion, religion, expression, assembly, association, accessing culture, the right to privacy. But then there are also rights that relate to basic needs, things like the right to food, the right to water, health, and housing. Underpinning all of these rights is the notion of non-discrimination. Non-discrimination is a value and a principle that applies throughout a human rights-based approach. Everything I've presented so far was written for states and for governments rather than companies. And obviously, a big focus of our work in terms of shared prosperity is the role of companies. And that's where the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights come in. They were unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011 and established clarity on the role of governments in terms of their duty to protect human rights and the role of companies in terms of their responsibility to respect human rights. We consider the UN Guiding Principles to be the floor, not the ceiling of expectations. And we'd also say that companies today are not meeting that floor. We're in a much better position than we were a decade ago when the UNGPs were first published. But there's still a lot of work to be done for companies to implement the UN Guiding Principles in practice. The UN Guiding Principles are based on 3 different pillars. The first pillar is the state duty to protect, and that sets out content as it relates to the role of states in setting the framework within which companies can respect and fulfill human rights. The second pillar is the businesses having a responsibility to respect human rights. And that consists of 2 main parts. One is establishing a policy commitment to human rights, and the other is establishing an ongoing process of human rights due diligence. And I won't go into detail as to what that process of human rights due diligence means, but the UN Guiding Principles have a lot to say about the processes that companies should deploy to undertake human rights due diligence. The third pillar states that individuals whose rights are harmed by companies must have access to remedy. And one of the very useful principles in there for companies is a principle that sets out what a good grievance mechanism looks like, the principles that should apply to operational grievance mechanisms that companies run for rights holders to make complaints and secure access to remedy. I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to Paloma, who's going to share a bit about what a human rights-based approach might mean to shared prosperity and some perspectives in terms of the role of investors. And I think, Paloma, I'm handing over at the right moment. And let me know when you want me to move the slides.
Sure, great. Thanks for that, Dunstan. So what Dunstan was highlighting, the guiding principles were adopted in 2011, so almost 10 years ago now. And so we've seen companies across sectors, including amongst technology companies, really start taking up this responsibility, some of them adopting human rights policies and processes. So that's good. But I think there's still a bit of a gap, we would argue, when it comes to those underlying rights that really contribute to creating shared prosperity. So on this slide, we have some of the rights that we think are especially relevant to the discussion of shared prosperity. And I think if we look at what Rachel from Ford highlighted at the beginning, it's a great example of how sort of artificial intelligence, automated decision-making can contribute to human rights abuses that some of them which are contained on this specific slide. So Rachel mentioned management tech at Amazon that potentially impacted the workers' right to health and healthcare, their right to a decent standard of living, among other things. And I think it's important to kind of think about, I really, with this slide, just would like to kind of help us, connect the dots when it comes to underlying human rights and the ways in which AI can really contribute negatively to that. So for example, just one example is the gender digital divide, which is a growing sort of concern when it comes to respecting and advancing women's rights. And a case in point would be e-health, which, as we know, we can really lead to more cost-effective and inclusive healthcare, while data analytics and AI can really help identify appropriate treatments and facilitate diagnoses. But we see that far too often in the case of women in particular, big data analytics offers, certain benefits by, showing and highlighting, gender-based discrimination, but oftentimes in the case of e-health in particular, it doesn't pick up information about diverse experience of women when it comes to healthcare and access to healthcare. And the same when it comes to gender-based discrimination, when it comes to ads online that target job-related searches, as well as underrepresentation of women in internet searches for certain professions, and of course, automated discrimination in hiring. There's actually allegations of Amazon's automated hiring tool that reportedly discriminates against women. So there are many ways in which, just looking at that one dimension, we see multiple rights at risk. So for example, the right of to a standard of living, the right to adequate health care, the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits, which is part of Article 27 of the UDHR, equal pay for equal work. And there's so many other examples we've heard of. Needless to say, the vast automation in the workplace and of the entire workplace of all jobs obviously impact all of the rights here listed. So I think that when we look at the ways in which companies are starting to adopt policies and conducting due diligence, this is really a big, significant gap. And we'd like to talk about how we advance on that. So I would just say that maybe we can move to the next slide, because I think one of the areas that we are especially focused on right now at the UN is figuring out how do we scale, how do we get companies in the tech sector to start thinking about all these risks. And one of the ways is to get institutional investors on board. In other words, to get them to begin to take up their own human rights responsibilities and engage companies on human rights. So for those of you who are familiar with investment activities, great. This won't come as any surprise, but I just want to flag that, at the end of the day, institutional investors are companies as well. So they also have a responsibility to respect human rights. Even those investors with minority shares in technology companies have a responsibility to do this. And so what that really means is that investors need to know the risk to people that are connected with their investment activities, and also show how they're taking action to addressing these risks. So in practice, this will involve considering risks to people when you're making an investment decision and on an ongoing basis once you're invested. And so, for example, in the context of AI, you would look to see as an investor, does this company have develop high-risk AI technologies? Do they have the right processes and policies in place to address those risks when it comes to those when it comes to deploying those technologies and so forth? If there are risks and one is invested, investors should be therefore using their leverage to engage those companies either through corporate engagements or by filing shareholder resolutions or proxy voting. Sometimes investors don't have enough they don't have enough leverage. So then they have to maximize that. They collaborate amongst themselves. They can engage with policymakers to get policymakers to adopt legislation, etc. So it really is it's quite a extensive, they have many opportunities to act. But of course, it's early days when it comes to investor awareness around these responsibilities. And so while there are some good examples, I think we'd like to also hear from you how we can further this work. And maybe I'll flag one good example and we can then go up to the next slide. Recently, or last year, an investor coalition representing more than $5 trillion in assets under management engaged Amazon on a range of topics, including AI and facial recognition on the one hand, but also specifically around worker rights and including rights associated to AI use in the workplace. And so I think that there are positive signs, but I think we really need to go quite a bit further. So if we go to the next slide, I'll finish here by just saying that for those who are less familiar with the investment community, there are multiple stages, obviously, of a tech company's growth, and the investors that are present across each stage of a tech company's growth are really significantly different players. But I want to just highlight here that everything I just said, the examples that I mentioned of investors tend to be once a company is public, once they're publicly traded. But I think when we think about the type of AI that we're concerned and the impacts of AI that we're concerned with, we really need to look much more closely at when a company is being born, right? So in other words, early stage investment, venture capital, where, by the way, investors tend to have more leverage. And I'll finish by saying that this is the stage where companies begin to, develop, refine their business models, as well as, of course, their products and services. So key opportunity for investors to influence there. So I think maybe to just make sure we have enough time, I'll leave it there. Maybe Dunstan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paloma. So with an eye on the clock, we'll just leave you with a few thoughts for the discussion. One is that there is a debate taking place right now on the relationship between human rights-based approaches, that, like we've just described, and ethics-based approaches to artificial intelligence and other disruptive technologies. To cut straight to the point, I think it's somewhat unfortunate that these two approaches are being often presented as in opposition to one another. You do one approach or the other one. Our experience has been that actually, in practice, there's some good complementarity between them, and that a human rights-based approach, like we've described today, provides a universal foundation upon which various ethical frameworks, choices, and judgments can be applied. So as we get into the discussion, this topic often comes up. How do we take an ethics-based approach at the same time as taking a human rights-based approach? We think that one builds quite nicely upon the other one. A few final points here. We think that human rights are a prerequisite of shared prosperity. The human rights frameworks include a range of different rights that are relevant to shared prosperity. So they do cover economic, social, cultural rights, not just civil and political rights. Sharing in scientific advancement and its benefits is a human right. There's actually quite a lot of recent new literature on this topic and what it means for companies. So that's something you might want to dig into. I've mentioned human rights-based and ethics-based approaches being complementary. One thing we haven't mentioned is that human rights-based approaches often force attention on the most vulnerable and the most marginalized. So the practical impact of taking this approach is to really think through the impact on a range of different communities who should be more at the center of our attention and have more of a voice at the table. A human rights-based approach to benefits, or some of the benefits that might arise from helping human rights be fulfilled, be realized, cannot offset harms. So everything we've been describing today is based on the premise that all harms that companies may be associated with should be prevented, should be mitigated, should be accounted for. A company cannot say that because we've achieved these human rights benefits, that offsets the harms. Now, often human rights might be in conflict. You can't achieve two human rights completely at the same time, but companies should always put in place deliberate approaches to prevent, avoid, mitigate the harms that might be associated with business activities. And then finally, respect for human rights is really becoming a universal expectation. We've heard about the role of investors today. The other thing perhaps to reference is the role of governments that are increasingly integrating the UN guiding principles into their laws, policies, and regulations. And the headline news here is that the European Union is proposing mandatory human rights due diligence by companies that will be based on the UN guiding principles. And so the questions we have for you for the discussion. The UNGPs provide a consensus-based framework for embedding concern for human rights throughout business processes. But as you know, we also have a proliferation of lots of ethics-based frameworks, lots of different sets of principles and codes that have been established. How can we make them complementary in practice? Are there shared prosperity concerns not covered by the UN guiding principles, or not directly as they should? We might want to have a discussion around a human rights-based approach to economic inequality and wealth distribution, and what human rights might mean in the context of thinking about inequality and the distribution of wealth. And then what do you see as the challenges and opportunities for motivating and scaling investor action to address questions of economic inclusion when evaluating prospective and existing investee companies, to Paloma's point, at every stage of the technology company lifecycle? A lot of the work on human rights tends to come quite late in that lifecycle. How do we consider human rights factors across that entire lifecycle?